Good morning. Welcome to our program on combating subtle discrimination. I'm Betty Elliott, Interim Dean and Director of Iowa State University's Cooperative Extension Service. To begin our program this morning, we've asked our Provost, Dr. Milton Glick, to set the tone of our discussion with some opening remarks. Provost Glick?
Thank you, Betty. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm especially pleased to learn about the tremendous response to this program by Extension staff. This reinforces my very positive views about the commitment of the Iowa State family to high-quality programming. For without a firm commitment to combat discrimination and to act affirmatively, we cannot achieve greatness as an institution. You, the staff of Extension, are Iowa State's window to the entire state. You set the tone in the state for fairness and equity. Iowa and Iowa State have a great history in terms of being a leader in this respect. For example, it was almost a century ago that George Washington Carver received his degree from Iowa State University. And it was within the last 2 years that Iowa became a leader in the nation by establishing that all public boards should be gender neutral. We will soon enter the 21st century. 1/3 of our nation will be minorities. The fastest increasing portion of the labor force are minorities and women. If we as a nation are to regain our competitive position, it is essential that we ensure the fullest opportunities for these groups. Our effectiveness in eradicating discrimination in our state and nation will dictate the quality of society that our children inherit, whether it will be a single society that works together with a high quality of life or a divided society. We at Iowa State need to be in the leadership role in this effort. I'm optimistic that this teleconference will contribute significantly to that effort, and I wish you much success in your deliberations today. Good luck.
Thank you, Dr. Glick. We're very fortunate today to have with us a distinguished panel of experts in this whole area of subtle discrimination. They are Jan Alderton, who is the Storm Lake City Councilwoman, and as of this week yet, she is the Iowa Fair Housing Project Manager. Inga Bunbury Langston is the Executive Director of the Iowa Civil Rights Commission. Donald Westergaard is the Director of the Commission on Persons with Disabilities, and Charles Samuels is Iowa State University's Affirmative Action Officer. As we begin, we'd like each of you to give us a brief idea of your thoughts on the question of subtle discrimination. Jan, let's start with you. Your article in the Des Moines Register last spring on negative attitudes in housing caught the attention of a lot of people in Iowa. What were some of the attitudes that you encountered as you've been working in fair housing?
Well, some of them weren't very nice. And I do have to preface this with I met a lot of nice people too. I met a lot of people who were interested in the project and the message that I had, but many didn't want to hear. Now, I drove a 28-foot motor home all over the state of Iowa. I stopped in all county seat communities, major population centers, with the fair housing message and definition of fair housing. Every person has the right to live peacefully and pleasantly in the house of their choice, neighborhood of their choice, price range they can afford. Now, just think about it. Everybody, whenever you're going to move, the first thing you do is pick an area that you will be comfortable in. People like yourself, that you want to live same kind of lifestyle. The house you can afford. Most of us assume this right. Many of us are not allowed this right. Well, lady, how dare you take taxpayers' money and run all over this state, stirring up trouble, educating people. They don't have to know their rights. We have no blacks in this county, and we won't have. From a county seat mayor, that's a little startling. I would let my property stand empty before I'll rent to bimbos and brats. Now, the growing class of discriminated victim is the young female head of household. Every community has young female head of households. And many of us see civil rights and we see black and white relationships. Well, substitute the term human rights. Human rights includes all of us. My children, your children, our mothers, our brothers and sisters, our friends. All of us are involved in areas where we could possibly, yes, and I hope I don't get discriminated against in my search for a job because I am an older female. And this program is subtle discrimination. Well, that's like asking, are you sort of pregnant? You either are or are not. And if discrimination is discrimination, it is in any degree. And why do we have to worry about degrees? It was very frustrating for me traveling around the state. When I applied for the job, I thought, oh, that sounds like too much fun to be work. Paid to drive all over the state, visiting with people. I mean, isn't that perfect? Then I found out that people didn't want my message. I like Iowa. I love Iowa. I'm a native Iowan. I think we're special people. If we in Iowa have a lot of attitudes discriminating against people, not making people of differences welcome, what is the rest of the country like? As my article said, heartland. That's what we are. I think so. Don't the rest of you? The heartland of the country? And it's just a little startling. I was not prepared for the negativism. And it became, we don't like the message, so shoot the messenger. And I'd rather argue than be ignored. So I really liked it when I had a crowd that was angry instead of when I had a few people who just kind of listened. The Des Moines Register article came out after I had worked the week of March 12th, which was the week that the new amendment went into effect. The day of reckoning was here. No longer can we ignore the addition of disabilities and families with children to the protected list. People won't rent to families with children. I have 8 children. My woodwork still looks good in my house, even though our house was full of children all the time. Children, just the presence of children does not mean that a house is going to be destroyed. It doesn't mean that the neighborhood is going to be disrupted. It's just like everything else. You can't make assumptions and generalizations. All of anything is never the same. And in housing, the project's message was, treat everyone the same. Give everyone equal access, equal opportunity, not equal access. You can't tell by looking at someone. So what would people say? Oh, I've got these people. They're the worst tenants I've ever had. I'm never going to rent to them again. Well, why did you rent to these people? Well, they look so good. You can't tell by looking at someone what kind of a tenant they're going to be. So collect applications, check references, pick the best applicant, just like equal opportunity. Keep your records to prove you're doing what you say you're doing. Give everyone equal opportunity to be considered. The rest of us have to learn to protect our rental history, just like we protect credit history and employment history. Doesn't that sound simple? Is that such a threatening message? I don't think so, but a lot of people did. Is that?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jan. You have experienced firsthand some of the kinds of things that we need to talk about today. Now, Inga, why don't you tell us how you define subtle discrimination?
That's a mouthful, I guess, to consider. Discrimination is when you you differ in a treatment or you favor someone because of a personal characteristic, and that's a very generic type of a definition. I think subtle discrimination is important in a way. I think a lot of times overt discrimination. We don't see the signs that say whites only or coloreds only. Most people are allowed access into theaters or restaurants, but you do have subtle forms of discrimination, covert forms. We know that in Iowa, grocery stores, when people write checks, on the back of the check will have a certain signal or abbreviation that distinguishes a black or a white person. That's subtle form of discrimination. We also know that, for example, when someone walks into a room, because of their personal appearance, certain judgments are made on that person. So those are some of the subtle forms of discrimination and prejudices that we see in our society. It's there, and we need trained professionals, and that's I consider my staff to be trained professionals to discern, what is discrimination and what is not discrimination, because it's becoming very sophisticated now. Just because there isn't the blatant statements or necessarily the blatant acts, it still exists in our society.
Okay, thank you very much. Don, how would this apply to people with disabilities, the people with whom you work?
I think probably there's two things, and one thing that would differentiate a disability from other types of protected classes is you may have access. Inga mentioned we have access to theaters. Not all persons with disabilities have access to theaters or public accommodations, public places. Persons with physical disabilities may be denied access because of steps instead of a ramp or something like this. So I think we would have to say, and I guess I would maintain that the most subtle of discrimination is the attitudes, the negative attitudes toward disabled persons and a lack of understanding. And I would use an example, I guess, the best bet, because many attitudes that transcend the whole population groups, whether it be a mental disability or a physical disability or some of the hidden disabilities, which we talk about, such as cancer and remission, some of these seem to go through all the gamut of disabilities. But for example, curb cuts are a good example. We have environmental barriers and we have attitudinal barriers. And I would maintain that the environmental barriers are really a manifestation of attitude, a negative attitude, a lack of understanding, a lack of thinking about persons. It used to be that most cities would put in one curb ramp in an area. If you've seen these are to help people get across the street, and yet there was a small community that had one they put in. Usually what you've done with only one curb ramp, you've declared open season on people because they can't get off to the other side. But that was just a common thing that people would do. Those cities would put in one curb ramp and say, well, now we've done our thing for disabled persons. There was one small town that we were called out to look at. They had put in the curb ramp, and what they had done was put the curb ramp leading down into the sewer grate, so that if a person comes down in a wheelchair, you've solved the problem getting the person across the street in that case, because they come down, the chair stops, and you send the person across the street. I don't think the city planner was sitting there thinking, I'm really going to destroy this person's mobility. I think he was just not thinking about it, and I think neglect is an attitude, a negative attitude toward individuals. Some of the other areas that we've come in contact with disability-wise is discomfort. A person can become disabled at any time through accident, disease, or what have you, and many times people feel uncomfortable. Non-disabled persons feel uncomfortable around disabled persons. So what we have found is that you may be going to an employment interview. The employer, feeling uncomfortable, wants to terminate that social interaction as quickly as possible because he's very uncomfortable with it, or she is very uncomfortable with it. And so what they will do is stay on a very superficial level with the individual. The individual that's disabled may come out and say, boy, that was really a good interview. It was really positive. We talked about a lot of things. Nothing really related to the job. It was just, let's get them in and get them out. What happens later on is the person never gets called. But as the employer comes across that resume, he'll remember that uneasy feeling that they had at that one time and may just discard that. It may not be aware of why they feel uncomfortable, but that's there. The other one is like a pity, the Jerry Lewis syndrome, I refer to it as. It's people feel sorry for it, and Jerry always talks about Jerry's kids. That implies to people that disabled persons are forever childlike and always going to be dependent. You have some others. Common example is if a disabled person comes in and you could be talking about something like the futures market or whatever that's really complex, and when you go to talk to the disabled person, I'll pick on Inga because she's next to me, but then you would say something like, well, isn't the weather nice today? You know, it's that condescending attitude where you talk down, you raise the decibel level. And there's always that feeling that if a person is limited in some way, then it must transcend their total being so that they're limited in all areas. And this type of subtle discrimination, I think, goes on constantly with disabled persons. It's something they have to try to overcome.
I think you've helped to raise our awareness, and I'm sure that when we get to the question period, there'll be some questions for you in that area, Don. Charles, if a person feels that he or she is being discriminated against, what should they do?
It's such a simple answer, say file a complaint. But basically what we try to do at Iowa State, and I think most agencies do, is try to resolve it at the lowest level. So that means if a person feels that he or she has been discriminated against, should first contact the supervisor of that department and try to resolve it at that point. If it cannot be resolved at that point, then you can go to the next highest level. But technically, you can file a charge with our office. You can file a charge with the Iowa Civil Rights Commission. Since we're talking about extension, you can file a charge with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. If it's in employment, you can file a charge with the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs. You can also file a charge with the EEOC after first filing with the State Civil Rights Commission. So you have a myriad of agencies with which you could file a complaint. If it's not employment, it could be any agency that gives this institution money. So the options are there.
Okay. Now, you talked about people who are employed by Extension. Would that same thing be true of people who are served by Extension in terms of clientele? If they're feeling discrimination, do they have the same recourses?
Well, you have special agencies with which you file complaints depending upon whether it's employment or whether it's services.
Okay.
If it's a service, then anyone who is denied service, say in extension programs, could file with the Department of Agriculture
Right.
or with the Office of Civil Rights of the U.S. Department of Education. So, and also with the Iowa Civil Rights Commission. So there are options for individuals who feel that they have been denied access to some service that is provided by Iowa State. And we do have a rule at Iowa State that says that our policy applies to all programs conducted by Iowa State University or in conjunction with Iowa State University.
So we have a very broad coverage there, and we need to be aware of that. We're going to take a short break now. If you have questions for any of our guests, please give us a call at 1-800-747-5505. That number again is 1-800-747-5505. We're on. Welcome back. Please phone your questions in to 1-800-747-5505. We have a studio audience, and I'm wondering if someone from the studio would have a question that we could start with.
I think maybe some real-life examples would help here. Have there been examples of clientele of ISU Extension that have filed charges of discrimination?
Well, I am disallowed to respond to that question. In our statute, we have provisions that require us to keep confidentiality, so I cannot respond to you directly. I don't know if Mr. Samuels would like to respond, but as far as the Iowa Civil Rights Commission is concerned, I cannot give you that information. I'm sorry.
I think I can respond to it. Yes, there have been many complaints filed by Extension Service over the years, but we're not inundated with complaints from the Extension. But I think most of the ones that we've had, we've been able to resolve them in a non-confrontational manner. And I think that we have worked out most of the problems. So I don't think there's any university or any section of the university where we have not had complaints. So you're not unique.
One of the complaints that we've dealt with in the last few months, which I think has application to many of us, is a county office not being disabled accessible. And we had a gentleman from that county who wrote to us and indicated that we were having evening programs in that office, and he was wheelchair bound, and that office was in the basement, and there was no way he could get to those programs. And that county extension council and the county director took that issue to heart, and they have now made arrangements for another meeting place for evening meetings when they think that there would be anybody interested in that meeting who might possibly have a handicap. And so it took some time to work out. It was some extra expense in order to do it, but it's the kind of thing that I think we have to be very alert to. I don't know if you have any comments about that, Don?
We've gotten calls not only from extension offices. I think that was the design problem a few years ago when all the offices were built around the state, but also county courthouses have had a problem. There is a law that deals, and I think Dr. Samuels alluded to it earlier, but it's Section 504 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, requires that anyone receiving federal funds needs to make at least programs accessible. And what you're describing is a program accessibility issue. They've taken it and moved it to a different area so that it is accessible. So it doesn't always require you to do the accommodation and restructuring the whole building. It can require you, with at least with federal funds at this point, being able to go out and doing something outside if that's what's available in the community.
Okay, thank you. We have a question that's been phoned in, so we'll save the studio audience for later, so you're not off the hook. Continue to think. This question came from the Des Moines area. Do we discriminate when we target our subject matter or programs to a specific audience? For example, the program might be targeted to the top 10% of the agricultural producers in a community. Is that subtle discrimination? Anybody want to speak to that?
Could you further explain the program that they're
Well,
referencing?
let's say we're having a program on futures marketing.
Okay.
And that's targeted to the people who might use that information. And so the mailing goes out to that group. The newspaper publicity indicates that the meeting's being held. I'm sure they wouldn't turn anybody away, but the subject matter as well as the topic has really been chosen with a special group in mind.
Well, I don't know if that's... I mean, you have to, I guess, define the word discrimination. What is illegal and legal discrimination in terms of which statutes per se? If you look at the Iowa Civil Rights Act, that probably would not be a per se violation of the Iowa Civil Rights Act, because an organization does have its choice in determining the type of programming. that it engages in the audience. But the fact that I would hope that the publicity, if it's in the newspaper, I assume everybody has that opportunity to read the newspaper. And so people are provided the opportunity to make the choice. Maybe subject matter, I might not attend the program,
It's choice.
but there is a choice provided, and I think that's very important.
Okay.
Where this wouldn't be a choice would be, again, the physical accessibility aspect of
right.
it. So if you hold a meeting that's open to the public, keep in mind some accessibility issues.
Okay, very good. Here's another question for you, Don. What responsibility or obligation do county offices have for accommodating the hearing impaired?
Okay. Again, this would be covered because of the federal fund recipient aspect under Section 504 at the current time. Probably what a lot of places have done is they've gone and trained people in sign language, active sign language interpretation, not necessarily hiring someone just specifically for that. What they have done is gotten a list of volunteers from the community who do know sign language and these types of things, but having people available for this. There are other ways of doing this, but again, as people come in the door, making it a sign, making people aware that this service is available. A lot of people have said that, gee, we don't want to hire someone just to sit there in case they're not used. So there are a number of ways of dealing with it. It does not mean that you don't have to find some way of communicating. Sign language is probably the preferable way. However, note, exchange, anything to be able so that you don't deny the person services.
And I would assume having some written information that would help them to know what was going on at the meeting would also be a way to answer that.
For open meetings, again, you would prefer, I think, a sign language interpreter, and there is Deaf Services of the state of Iowa and the Department of Human Rights that could be contacted.
Okay, very good. Thank you. We have another question which relates to the county office, area office, or office on campus. Cooperation and acceptance by coworkers plays a major role in employee retention and productivity. Who bears the responsibility for fair treatment for maintaining professional rapport? Who wants to tackle that one?
I'll try it.
Okay.
I think the major responsibility in any employment situation rests with the supervisor of that department. How that person responds to the new employee or the different employee sets the tone for the rest of the people in that department. If we feel that the people that we're hiring because we have to, and that's communicated to the rest of the people in that department, then they're going to be responding to them in a different way. If we show that that person is truly a part of our faculty or staff, that we really want that individual, we respect that individual's input, then I think that too will be reflected and passed down through the rest of the system. So I think how one gets along with one's co-workers depends upon the supervisor.
Okay. Just like to piggyback on that. As the workforce continues to diversify, as Dr. Glick stated, I agree. The managers have to know how to manage diversity in the workplace because there are different cultures, there are different experiences, and so that manager has to have the sensitivity, like you say, to set the tone and to show that differences that each one of us has, that's an asset to the workplace. That's something that we can all tap into and learn from, and it has to be a very positive attitude and something that the co-workers will share. And it's also important that the co-workers open their minds to the differences and that they should be celebrated and not feared.
It seems to me that the point that you made about coworkers having a responsibility is an important one. The office manager or supervisor can set the stage and set the tone, but everybody has a responsibility to make that work. And we can't say, well, it didn't work because of supervisor. I mean, it didn't work because all of us weren't involved.
I think that minimizes it.
Okay.
Depending upon the supervisor's actions.
All right.
It's not going to eliminate all of the subtle discrimination that occurs in a department, but I think it will minimize it.
Okay, fine. So you're saying that the person in charge has a major responsibility to set the tone.
Under the law, the person in charge is responsible for maintaining an atmosphere that's free of racial, sexual, religious, and other discriminatory overtones. And if that person gives the impression that this person is not really wanted but has to be there, I think that person is the one who is responsible for the attitudes of the employees in that unit.
Okay, very good. Thank you. We have another question that's been phoned in from northern Iowa. A quote in the newspaper said, "Although the boys didn't win, they represented our community well." It went on to say that the Sunday winner was a Vietnamese boy who was playing the piano, and the second place winner went to a Negro boy singing Old Man River.